Welcome to this panel. I'm just turning off the computer converter. Please turn off introducing yourself.
I'm Ken Konkol. I've been reading science fiction for over 60 years. I'm going to conventions about 45. Enjoy it. I mainly take pictures and have a good time.
Speak up, please.
I say I take pictures and have a good time.
I'm Finseth. I haven't read science fiction and stuff quite as long as my co-panelist. Just probably about 10 years off each of those numbers. I definitely am interested in this subject, and I studied general systems theory and worked with complex systems all the time. So it explains my interest. I approached this question with the saying, or the clip, asking whether a machine can think is like asking whether a submarine can swim. A submarine moves through the water, but it does not swim. I mean, no fish would recognize it as swimming. While machines may eventually think, and that's why this question is phrased as a when, I don't think that they will necessarily think the way we do. And it may be very difficult for us to realize that they're thinking.
Yes, well, there are a number of great minds in science fiction. There's HAL 9000, there's Harley, there's the grand omnipotent device that Harley invented, the true God machine. When is a computer sentient? Is Watson sentient? Watson can beat a human playing Jeopardy. But what criteria are you going to use to, say, offer citizenship to a computer? Anybody have questions?
Not a question so much as Turing test.
It was a good try for 1935. A really good, phenomenally good try. It has guided a lot of things. But to be honest, we have stuff that we know is not sentient that can pass it. And there's quite a few beings that I would consider sentient that probably couldn't pass it. So it was a phenomenally good try, but really it's not a good test. And a lot of recent examples have shown that there are programs that can pass it, but you do not consider them sentient. We're just really, it's not hard to fool someone for a reasonable period of time. Really, it isn't.
Yeah, Facebook is full of people saying, yes, I have a computer that'll pass, and others that say, no, your computer doesn't pass because of this. You got a comment, Lynn?
There has been some discussion about what sentience is and whether certain other animal species should be considered sentient in their own right or in their own environment. Whales and dolphins in particular, some of the primates being looked at of just how much, where would they be on a sentient spectrum?
Yeah, very much so. The panel in particular is about computers as opposed to other species. But one of the things that emphasizes is sentience is not a yes or no thing. It's an emergent phenomenon, which means it's more than the sum of its parts. And when you have it once you've got it, if you start picking it apart, you can't find the sentient component that's in there. It's the way that everything is assembled and interacts. So there's going to be degrees of sentience always. There's going to be things that are sentient in some ways but not others, for whatever definition we eventually come up with sentient. And whales, dolphins, primates are examples. They certainly show many characteristics that we consider sentient, but they're not to the point where I would want to necessarily put them in a voting booth. That's true of a lot of people too, but that's a separate issue. And so, you know, if people are, as a species whole here, you know, primates and dolphins and whales are maybe here, and I'm being vague in particular. You know, are they all the way there? Probably not. But they clearly have a lot of elements. Similarly with computers, are they there? I don't believe so today. But go out 50 years, and I think we will look back and say, oh, this happened, and we missed it. And it happened maybe a second time, maybe a third time. Because it was so different, we didn't recognize it when it happened. So what are some of those elements that we can look for, though, that might clue us in that it's actually happening?
I have a more philosophical question, more so, is a human brain capable of making something that is the same as another human brain, or is it always going to be like 1 degree lower than what we're able to create, I guess? Like,
Given that protons, neutrons, and electrons can create human brains,
yep,
I see no reason to assume that there's any inherent limit. And
Okay.
the human brain should be able to create and build something much more complex than itself.
So when I think of sentience, I think of the ability to learn and change. And for at least 10 years, there have been robots that search the internet, and they learn, and they converse, and they express opinions, and eventually they change. Is that not sentience?
By that criteria, I would say yes.
It's program behavior.
Whether that is the right
But
criteria,
it's program behavior that changes itself.
It's meant to, you're talking about chatbots impersonating real people in talk rooms.
No, I'm talking about, there was one robot in particular, and actually I research sex trivia for a living, and sex robots in Japan are becoming more and more interactive. And in Maryland or something, 10 years ago, some dude built this female robot to talk to. She searches the internet, she talks to him, she changes her opinions. I think her name is Vivian.
Does she change her programming?
No, she does not change her program.
but what does it mean to change your programming versus not change your programming?
She changes her mental habits, not her heart.
Do we change our programming when we learn something new?
We change our role actively.
But
No,
we can't change
that's a
our
different
program.
question.
No.
If I learn another fact, if I form another opinion, have I changed my programming? Or am I just gathering more data? I mean, we don't know the answer to that. So I wouldn't limit it, I wouldn't ask a question like, does she change her programming? No, therefore she must not be insentient. That presupposes the answer that it's no, and I wouldn't want to presuppose things like that.
wouldn't our DNA be considered our initial programming?
Possibly our neural pathways, which you can
DNA
change.
is not programming in the same sense that writing programs for computers is programming.
Yeah.
You have someone in the back.
If sentience is considered an emergent property of a sufficiently complex system, what about something like the commodities market, a complex social process? Could that itself become sentient?
It can only react to its input. You
But
have,
isn't that true of us? We can only react to whatever we observe in our world.
yeah, but we can come up with original ideas.
But
Whereas
they
a
start
program,
from our own input.
Are they original?
Yeah, there are some arguments that nothing is ever truly original.
Right.
If I may go simplify the answer. The commodities market, while it's complex and it has chaotic behavior in many ways, is not a state machine per se. It's a real-time interaction, sort of the way swirling water is a real-time interaction. It doesn't have a memory. It's just reacting to what it is. I think sentience is an emergent phenomena. That does not mean that all emergent phenomena are sentient. I think partly there needs to be a state machine in there with memory.
Why?
Why? Because
I mean, are we state machines with a memory? Is that how you
we are very much our state machines that have memory. I can remember a lot of things. And the thing is, with memory, without memory, if you have 10 inputs, your outputs are going to be dictated by those inputs. With memory, the outputs can, I won't say change uncontrollably, but essentially incalculably from the inputs. And that's actually has to do with like, the stopping problem and things like that. Once you get to a certain level, you can no longer determine the output based on just the inputs anymore. And that's been proven theoretically.
It sounds like a neural net.
Yeah, but I was just talking about a simple, 8-bit CPU state machine, with a 64K memory. You don't have to get a neural net.
There are people with no long-term memory that are sentient.
But they have short-term memory.
Yeah, but you come back the next day and talk to them, they don't remember anything that happened the day before. So yes, you have short-term memory, but they're still sentient, even though they don't have long-term memory.
I've never interacted with enough person in such a way enough to know to form an opinion. But memory can be, when I was talking about memory, I was like, even a 10-minute memory is a memory. There's a huge amount of state that can be stored in a 10-minute memory.
It's still some RAM.
Yeah, it's still some RAM, not RAM.
Realistically, is this going to happen, the sentient machine, for any other reason than that people deliberately try to create one?
I think it can happen by accident.
You think it could?
On their way to doing something else, we just put enough stuff together and some magic mix happens and it became sentient, and then maybe we accidentally killed it. We didn't realize even what we were doing. But that's why I say we might look back at it 10 years and say, wait a minute. Now that I see what happened now, look, that actually happened 10 years ago, but we missed it at the time. I think that's a very realistic outcome.
Prime example.
Unfortunate for the intelligence involved, but.
Sort of going back to like the title of the panel, when does turning off a computer become murder? And we've been talking a lot about sentience, which is great, but what's to say that, that's just an assumed value that we assign to something. Why must we use sentience or ability to create something as whether something is worthy enough to live?
True, and I'm certainly willing to entertain other suggestions for terms or whatever.
I don't have anything off the top of my head. I just find it interesting what assigned value we give to whether something deserves to live or not. Because there are some people who maybe have brain damage and are not able to create any new thoughts and are only able to mimic other thoughts. But we still consider, well, most of the population would hopefully consider that they should still be allowed to live.
Go to a better extreme. If I have a pet fish, it should still deserve to live, well, wantonly. If I have a pet plant, or I guess pet plant, you shouldn't go killing things indiscriminately even if they're killing them. Life deserves to live, sort of. So you don't have to even argue that level. You can go way down and say things deserve to live without having any trace of sentience.
So I think that just brings in an interesting level too. You could, I guess, theoretically argue right now that you should never turn off your computer because you might be killing it every time it is. But that
One could make that argument.
you could. I wouldn't because that doesn't really suit for my current beliefs. But it's interesting that it would probably change with every individual person.
If
as to
someone
where
came
that
to
line
me
would
and
be.
said that, I would say, that's an interesting belief, and I respect it and honor it, and please then do not be consistent, do not turn off your computer. I'm not going to challenge him and say he or she is wrong. I don't know enough.
Yeah, no, I find the concept of life and value of life to be very interesting. So I'm at this panel is to hear it discuss.
If you consider people who have lost the ability to think for themselves, such as Alzheimer's patients, sentient, if they can't form an opinion from their own experience.
Interesting question.
I think we have to define it in terms of logic, machinery, things you can build, things you can easily parse, things that are binary, and then the ephemeral things like emotions that we can't parse at all. Emotions, creativity, things that we can't build.
So you're saying that they may not be sentient, but they're still human.
Correct.
The children behind the red band.
Oh, but his hand was up longer than mine. That's all I'm saying.
You got to
We've been going, the machines evolving into people, but what if, would it be possible to create a machine that could hold a human consciousness in it, rather than having something evolve in it? Could we make a body and then place the human mentality, or maybe from a person, into that machine itself? and have it sustain that.
Well, that's an old
I don't see why
science
not.
fiction axiom, but nobody's done it yet.
But could we? I see no reason why it's fundamentally impossible. It's difficult, but,
There are so many billions and trillions of pathways inside the human mind. I
well,
think that to build something that complex, it would be the size of the planet.
no, because there's about 30 or 40 of them in this room, so. Actually, I did the math many years ago. I mean, there was this quip back in the 50s that if you were to build a computer that was as much as a brain, it would occupy a city block and, require Niagara Falls power it. Well, I remember back as microprocessors got really big in the early 80s, I went and did the math, and I realized a computer, and even back in the 80s, that had the same number of connections and active elements as the brain would be about the size of a desk and require the same amount of power as an electric oven. That was in the 80s. These days, we could probably physically fit it in the head, although it might require a little more power than you can get through, 15 amps or something, or something. That doesn't mean that any computer you build that size is the same as a human brain. There's a lot more to it than just the number of active elements. But we have the technology to get something that approximates it in even approximately head size now. Maybe better. I haven't been tracking current design element sizes on microprocessor dies. But that's not the point. We know we can build something with enough complexity. That doesn't mean we can replicate the brain. Okay, those are two different questions. But we're progressing at such a pace. Am I going to say no, never? Heavens no.
Do any of you work on advanced computers in your regular 9-to-5 job? A man back there in green had a question. Yes, you holding up the wall.
Well, I was just make a comment on the other, on his, which is I was also thinking of, in the title of the panel, when does it become murder? If we did develop a specifically powerful computer to run a simulation of a human brain, maybe transfer, everything from a living person to that computer, and then with turning that off, qualify for the murder reference in the title of the panel.
Well, it depends on whether you did a copy or a move. If you did a move to get it in there, then you could argue that, it's murder. If you did a copy, now that's a very different question.
Is the copy a separate person?
Yeah.
That's exactly.
If you copy it onto two computers, which is the person and which is the fake?
So, I don't think our legal system certainly has a way of handling that yet. That doesn't mean that it couldn't adapt, but it would be, the specifics of how you got there become very important too.
Man moves back to the door.
Yeah. Let's assume we're talking about a person which has been moved onto a computer. When you turn off, what's happening? Is it when you turn it when the system gets restarted? Are they born anew, or old memory? Is it just like time stopped for them? Is it really? I think there's a difference. Is it just interrupting a stream of conscious?
Good question. We'll have to try it at some point and ask the person. That's the only way we're ever going to find out.
I think it depends on your shutdown program. When I turn off my computer, I can either cause it to remember where it was, and I boot it back up, and it goes right to the pages left, no matter how many I had open, or it can boot up from scratch. So
I'm not sure I like the phrase "turn off" for the purposes of this panel anyway. I mean, what does that mean? If a human goes and has surgery, he's turned off for a period of time, and if the surgery goes well, he comes back to consciousness and remembers, picks up where he left off, essentially. So,
Yeah.
is smashing a computer with a hammer so that it doesn't completely able to function anymore murder? I think for me would be a better.
Well, except that with anesthesia, which is what we're talking about surgery, well, we consider it to be a reliably reversible process. It doesn't mean it is 100% reversible, but for all intents and purposes, you can assume it is, as rare cases. And we don't consider that murder when you put someone under for, because the analogy would be sleep, which we all do every night, for the most part, on average. I'm not talking about con. yes, you sort of go out for a while and come back in, and that's a whole interesting philosophical question. What is consciousness? How does it go off and back on again, and all those things? But as a society, we don't consider sleeping murder or anesthesia murder. And of course, with a computer that has a good, reliable shutdown protocol and preserves its state, you could say turning it off, is this going to sleep in the literal sense as opposed to the figurative sense we currently use. Turning it back on is waking up again in the literal sense. Presumably, we'll, for the sake of simplicity, say it's the same person and we don't have to get into those things. One of the very different things about a computer in this case is that the processor and the storage are very separate in a sense where I can turn you off, pull out the CPU, put in a new one, turn you back on, and the computer still picks up exactly where I left off, which is hard to do with a person right now. You yank out the brain and put a new one in, because the processing and memory are so intertwined.
So like the hard drive and RAM, one is permanent storage, RAM is temporary once you when you turn on the power, it's gone.
But we can also reliably clone hard drives, which is again difficult.
Way in the back, yeah.
So isn't it possible that we can just make them mimic sentience so that it seems very real but isn't actually necessarily truly sentient? It's kind of like the control program learning, like the robot can actually learn past the program to learn. So.
We have the mimic sentience down pretty well right now.
Pass the Turing test.
Yeah, we got programs that play Jeopardy. There's enough of stuff that, but those programs we also know, and we're pretty certain they're not sentient. So what this goes back to, the Turing test for 1935 was a phenomenal good idea, but we know a lot more now. It's 80 years later. We probably need to figure out a much better test to figure out whether something is sentient. And again, for difference to your question that was asked, is sentience even the right term to be using? And is using that term presupposing an answer that gets us into trouble because it keeps us from thinking about the problem the right way? Bring back my summary that's so
The question about, is turning off the computer comparable to us sleeping or going into anesthesia? It could be, but I mean, right now neurologists don't know what the heck consciousness is. Whatever consciousness is, and memory and selfhood, as far as we can tell, our brains are evolved to suspend that and bring it back. If we knew what consciousness was and we deliberately designed a computer that was conscious in the way a human is conscious and was designed to be suspended and brought back, then turning it off wouldn't be murder if we'd done it correctly. But what if the consciousness was an accidental, emergent property of the functioning of the computer and we didn't know how it got that way? Turning it off might stop that and it might not come back, or it might come back and be a different person and the original one might actually be gone. So it really depends on where the consciousness came from and whether we know how it got there and how to maintain it.
Well, and we also, computers these days often are not turned off for long periods of time. It's getting to the point where turning them off is the exception rather than the rule. And as an emergent phenomena, what if the consciousness is composed of some weird combination of 100 computers? Maybe you turn one of them off and back on, and the consciousness continues. Whatever it is continues with minor changes and things, but it's sort of the same, but it's the same entity. I mean, at that point, it becomes actually fairly difficult to turn off.
And what counts as turning off a computer? When I turn off my computer, I leave it plugged in and it's still consuming power because it maintains its clock. If I unplug it, then when I plug it back in, it thinks it's 2002 again. But when it's still plugged in, it's not really actually off in the sense that like my toaster is off.
Well, and in fact, most modern computers go to sleep, and there's levels of sleep. There's deeper sleep,
yeah.
But they still run low-level things that keep the computer running,
yeah.
And the clock being updated. They'll actually wake up every now and then and do some housekeeping, go back to sleep. I mean, it's not a sleep like stop drawing any power until let it go. They can do that if the batteries eventually run down, but most of them don't.
It's called hibernation. That is an option.
When I go to sleep, I'm on standby. I'm still a conscious person because I have dreams. Now, if you put a computer to sleep, is it going to dream? Is it conscious?
How can you tell?
Sal 9000 asked that very question in 2010. Will I dream?
The response was, I don't know, Sal.
And for people who don't dream, are they
The
still
blondes
conscious?
all the way to back.
Dreams don't render.
Going for other criteria besides sentience, what about desire for self-preservation?
Desire for freedom?
Yeah.
Alcohol?
Sex?
Well, desire for freedom would imply that it somehow feels unfree, which it might. I mean, I'm not saying it couldn't, but if this is all you've ever known because you just emerged into consciousness, sentience, whatever, you may not feel the limits, at least not right away.
How would you know what constituted freedom if you're trapped in a box?
You might eventually learn, you know.
What about desire in general? As far as I know, no computer has it yet.
You haven't worked with computers very much, have you?
I'm going to ask mine, what do you want from me?
I work with computers for a living in very deep and intimate ways, and they know what you're doing, and they know who's boss, and they have desires. And if you don't believe it, they'll say is you haven't really worked with computers extensively. They're, the same way your goldfish might have desires.
So I'm going to compare computers to humans in terms of when you're talking about, sleeping, hibernating, boot up processes. Those are involuntary functions. And basically, death occurs when you have no more involuntary functions. So there's that. That's just the one point I wanted to make. And then,
interesting.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting observation.
Well, and then my other observation is maybe humanness is plasticity. We are now learning with fMRIs and things like that the brain is capable of changing itself. It changes its own hardware, it changes its own neural pathways. Disorders of the brain change those things. A computer cannot yet change its own hardware. It might be able to reprogram software, but perhaps that is why it can't be plasticity.
But again, this goes back to the submarine swim thing. Computers are fundamentally built very differently than human brains. And the analogy would be changing the programs.
The latest processor chips are coming out with reprogrammable logic inside. Not just the processor, but they have ASICs built in. So they can be programmed themselves.
Someone back in the corner there, and then we'll work our way across. Yeah, you.
Recently the Supreme Court found that corporations have political free speech rights, and that contributions were, couldn't limit them based on that simplification. And recently, with the Hobby Lobby decision, they now have religious rights. And if murder can be considered that a person has a right to life, and murder is the illegal deprivation of that state, then, we think of a corporation, as computer developed, a corporation totally run by a computer system, right? And if it's, maybe somebody wants to shut it down, but then a legal challenge based on its right to exist. If it's got, political free speech rights and religious rights now, then a legal entity would have a right to continue to exist.
Are you trying to say if I kill a corporation, that's murder?
Well, it has religious rights and political rights recently. It's recently been under
Actually,
right?
let's back up. If you look at the Hobby Lobby decision, it's the fact, one of the key elements of the Hobby Lobby decision is that it was a very closely held family corporation, and it's not a publicly traded corporation. And one of the things is they made very clear that in any sort of public ownership or even broad spectrum private ownership, where, the fact that it was basically the same family and they had the same values was one of the key elements. If you had 5 people who didn't necessarily share the same religious belief, then almost certainly this decision would not apply to you. And certainly in any sense of a public corporation, it would not apply. So there were very specific limiting factors in this one thing. That said, yes, corporations are defined as legal entities, synthetic legal entities under our law. There's good reasons for that, which is a different panel. But nowhere, and they do definitely have certain rights, and they have, and one of the things that's been said is free speech rights, but nowhere has it been established anywhere that they have a right to exist. It's only the only relevant thing would be in a bankruptcy. You cannot do a voluntary liquidation as opposed to a bankruptcy. Okay, if you're staying out of bankruptcy court at all completely, then you must settle all debts to the satisfaction of creditors, which is not the same as 100%. Other than that, that bankruptcy is where you don't settle them 100%. That's the only constraints on any new corporation. So yeah, I wouldn't use corporations as an example here.
Well, in the context of a computer could ever be murdered, then you'd have to consider that the computer would have to have some legal status, such as a legal entity as recognized by a law, for the, in the context of the question about the panel.
Yeah, well, go out 1,000 years. I imagine we'll be in a situation where artificial entities, I'm using the word computer, but artificial entities of some sort, probably will have rights under law. I mean, go out a sufficiently long time and assuming that, the society doesn't collapse, we'll get to that point because that's the direction everything's going. Is it 50 years? I don't know. But you go out far enough, it's going to be there. I don't see any reasonable arguments that it would never happen. So now it's a question of when.
I think in more of a context of somebody else attacking that corporation that's run by a computer system and terminating it illegally, not through the bankruptcy process, and that having a legal consequence for like murder. But
well, I don't think corporate law would be its savior at this point.
Yeah, but it'd be criminal.
Let's see, there was a woman, you.
I think that a bigger issue that we're running into is not describing when computers can think, but what is life and what is consciousness. Because when I went into anesthesia 3 months ago, for all intents and purposes, my conscious life stopped. It was suspended. That was over and it was restarted. So I think that turning off a computer is more akin to going into to anesthesia, because we retain our memories, we retain our function, but in a lot of ways, I know it's very convenient for us to think about it as sleep, but it's not sleep. It's much more closer to death, actually, except that it's reversible death. So I think that's the question that we're struggling with more than anything else is what is life and what is consciousness, and I think that's why we're not able to come to a solid answer of like, okay, well, when does it become murder, because we can't define when something is conscious.
Yeah, so we're talking about continuums of things, but we like to talk about them without recognizing that enough, I think. You wouldn't kill a kid, but it's okay to turn off a super complicated computer. But you can kill a fish, but that fish isn't as complicated as the computer. Like, all these weird things are kind of meshing all funky.
It depends on how you find complicated. Can you
Well,
build a fish?
No. No.
I doubt that anybody in this room, myself included, could actually build a computer these days.
A single bacterial cell is more complicated than any computer we've built.
You underestimate fish. So there's, I think we need to think in terms of continuums, and sentience goes up and down this thing, and it has all these different terms that define it, but it's like a different setting of each one. It's not always going to be the same thing, is what I'm trying to say. And so, whatever.
All right, back to the comparison between a computer and somebody who's got Alzheimer's. My mother does have Alzheimer's, so I'm used to dealing with this sort of thing. With the computer, when I'm at work and my computer can't find something because it's not where it's supposed to be, or something happened to where it was directed to go, my computer just stops and we have to either reboot it or fix it or do something. When my mother can't find the information she's looking for, where it was stored before, she figures out a way around. She's aware that she doesn't know where this information is anymore. There is a difference there between what the computer is doing and what the human brain is doing, as far as, I think sentience is probably more of the being aware of how to pull the information and how to change if something's not where it's supposed to be. Because most computers, if there's a problem with where the information is stored, that's it. But with the human brain, it's a lot more fluid. It's a lot more, it can relearn things. You have brain trauma, it can relearn.
Well, I never contended that today's computers were sufficiently advanced that turning them off would be considered wrong. But I've also looked at how fast things have changed in the last.
Oh yeah, I had a friend, actually, adult parent of a friend of mine growing up, who actually, he was one of the programmers, system analysts working on the Apollo space system. And the computers that they used for Apollo that filled rooms, when he got a 386, he said, I can do more of that programming on this 386.
Yeah.
So yeah, the computers are expanding, but they still deal with information pretty much the same, similar ways. The human brain is much more capable of changing how it processes. Yeah, and fish can too, but not as quickly.
If you look at smartphones and the things that Google is doing with services like Google Now, and Apple is doing with things like Siri, the way they pull information together is very, very different from the way computers were doing it years ago. And the deductions and conclusions they come to, and the ways that they can be helpful to you, are very, very different. And this is an Android phone, I use Google Now all the time because I travel. It amazes me what it comes up with. Not just, and it isn't just things out of my history. It's saying, oh, you're here and I noticed that you like things in this area, you might want to check out this museum. Out of 50 other museums that it could have suggested, but it didn't. You know,
my Facebook page do that all the time.
The point is, the way that computers are bringing information together now is very, very different from things that happened in Apollo, or even what they did 10 years ago, because the subsystems you're building on are much more complex. Basically, you're not only standing on the shoulders of giants, but on the shoulders of giants who are standing on the shoulders of giants who are standing on the shoulders of giants. So the things you can do are now much more complex, and it ain't stopping. They keep building giants faster and faster, which is why I go back and say, this is going to happen. I'm not giving you a date, but it would really surprise me 50 years from now, we didn't have what I would consider to be sentient computers. And that doesn't mean that they would have gone through the legal system and have rights such that turning one off is legally murder, but you probably people will be proposing it. You know, that's where I'm saying it's different now. I lost track of who's next, sorry.
Now, do you think the latent fear that's, we have a lot of sci-fi that talks about machines taking over, machines versus humanity, flesh versus wiring. Do you think latent fears like that may tie our hands from, excelling? Like maybe some research has been done and found things, but maybe they felt it was too unsafe to push machines that far? Or?
That's not the way the human race works. You might have said, wait a minute, no. But if one group is doing it, 50 other groups are also doing it, and at least 45 of them are going to say, what the heck, full speed ahead.
Yeah. Well, if I had the only sentient computer there ever was, I would kill it.
Why?
To save humanity.
Machines are ruthless.
So he's afraid. Skynet.
And many individuals would be afraid, and anything new scares people. But we adapt and we get over it. And by and large, society is a whole lot less scary and more safe than it's ever been in the history of humankind.
Really? With Facebook recording us? Are you serious?
I was judging more by the fact that the number of wars keeps going down and the percentage of the population of the planet involved in organized violence keeps going down. Now, remember, the population keeps going up and the reporting keeps getting better, so you hear about more of them. But if you go back 100 years, proportionally many more were happening, most of which you never heard about. It takes scholars going back and digging up ancient records to say, oh, wait a minute, 350,000 people died in this conflict that nobody had ever heard of outside of the local area. when you put all that information together, the statistics are it's getting safer, and we're getting better. And back there?
Is it true that computers rely almost exclusively on if-then statements?
No.
Whereas,
Not anymore. Not anymore. No. That's the third giant up from the bottom. We're about 20 or so. Okay. Stacked high at this point. So yes, they're down there in the bottom, there are then statements, but okay, how many of you know what an emergent phenomena really is? Raise your hand if you understand the term. Okay, about a third of the people here. Let me give you a simple example. Lego bricks. You all know Lego bricks, right? Yep. I build a little thing this big. You know, it might be a house for a mini person or something that you wouldn't know what to call it a house you live in. You know, I keep adding more bricks to rows, and eventually, you know, I get a house this big. Can I live in it? No. It's not a real house. It's still a toy house. Okay. At some point, I build a house, you know, the size of this room, or you know, out of Lego. Now, granted, the walls are all whole hard plastic, and the bumps are awful to lie on, but it's large enough that you would recognize it as a house, and it would have several rooms, you know, and things like that. Maybe not a working bathroom or a kitchen, but okay. So someplace between the one that was this big and the one that's the size of this room, it emerged into being a house. You can't ever point the point. There's no point at which you can say, I added this one more brick, and before it was definitely a non-house, and now it's definitely a house. All you can say is that somewhere along the line of transition, and because of the nature of an emergent phenomena, note the weird syntax there, but that's the right syntax to use, it can transition from one to the other, but there's never ever going to be a point in the middle that you can say it transitioned. That's the sort of thing we're talking about. You go from, it's definitely not conscious, to it's definitely conscious, but you never pin what happened, or definitely not sentient. And we talked about a bunch of weird edge cases, like Alzheimer's and chimpanzees and things. And they're all they're all in there, and they all clearly have elements of sentience, and depending on other factors, you might categorize them one way or the other way. That's not the point. The point is it's a continuum. And everybody has their own opinion about where individual things are, and that's okay. We don't have to agree. But if you go sufficiently far over there, everyone can sort of agree it's not sentient. And if you go sufficiently far over there, everyone agrees it's sentient. It'll be so obvious that we all agree. But there's this huge range in the middle. And that's what we're arguing about, and we don't have a clear answer on it.
Probably right in front of a paradigm shift on that very subject.
I'm sorry, I lost track.
I've read about the difference between analog and digital computing, and I don't think I read it in a particularly scientific magazine, so I don't pretend to actually understand the difference. But do you think that computers that would be called sentient or conscious or intelligent, do you think they're more likely to be emerged from digital computing or from analog computing?
The difference between analog and digital is syntax. You can do, they're equivalent, and it's a matter of which is easiest to build. And right now, with our current technologies, it's a whole lot easier to build digital computers and simulate the analogness that you need. There's nothing special about an analog computer.
So you can simulate analogness through digital?
Yes, it's trivial. See any video game. Well, I mean, it takes a lot of math and stuff, but it's easy to do. Similarly, you can use analog computers and simulate digital ones, which is what happens at the bottom level when you're getting into the sides of all these little transistors and things.
Is it true
They're analog devices which are simulating digital. The key thing is that, and the reason why digital is better is essentially built-in error correction. If I have an analog signal between 1 and 3 volts, and I get it wrong somehow, I can't tell. But with digital, it's going to be, somewhere around 1 volt and somewhere around 3 volts. And if I get it 2.75, I correct it back to 3.
One of the
and therefore, I can do a lot more with it without losing quality of data.
One of the things that I read though is about the biggest difference is the error correction, and I read a suggestion that because the way that our brains function is more comparable to analog, and there are errors and fuzziness in our brains.
There's ways to simulate that using digital techniques, which are very trivial.
Okay.
First round of programming is one of those things you learn.
But does it require pseudo-random numbers or
No.
true randomness?
No. And both are available.
Yes,
Back on the discussion of emergent technology, or emergent
Phenomena, yeah.
phenomena. You were using the idea of a small house of bricks up to the big house of bricks. And I think you also have to include in there the user of the house kind of deciding when is it going to cross over.
Right.
A small person might consider a much smaller house a house than somebody that's big or somebody that wants a mansion. So the emergent technology is or the emergent phenomena is somewhat dependent on the observer as to when the observer is
And
going
the
to
use
say.
for which you intend to put it to, so on. I was sort of averaging it out and saying that most people in this room, if you had a structure that was about the size of this room,
Yeah.
you know, as a standalone building, you could call it a house and we wouldn't argue about it too much.
Yeah.
But you're right, the intended use matters. But the key thing is not so much the intended use or any particular size, but, you know, if it's the size of this room, you might call it a house. If you take away a block from each direction, you'd still call it a house. It's not, there's not any difference there. If you add a block in each direction, it's still a house. You know, the specific size is important. But if you get it down this big, I couldn't get my foot in it, so I wouldn't really call it a house for me. So somewhere in there is a transition, a phase change, but you don't know where. And it's going to differ for different people and depending on the application. But even when we're on the phase change boundaries, it's fuzzy. It's not hard.
So, you know, if my car runs out of gas, the light will come on that says the engine's empty. But I would never say the car wants gas. But if the cat's bowl is empty and it starts crying, I feel the cat does want food. So it doesn't seem like two ends of a continuum. It seems like the car isn't on the board. Back at the beginning of the hour when you were talking about how you work with computers and they know who's boss and they want things, at first I thought you were joking, and then I felt like you weren't joking, and you said, well, maybe it wants things the way my goldfish does. I would love to hear more about that.
We human beings love to project emotions onto other. Your cat is clearly hungry and it wants to be fed, but when we say wants to, there's a degree of projection there. Huge degree of projection. Left to its own devices, in a world that's quote unquote natural, it would probably go try to find food. But that doesn't mean it wants food.
So I would say
want
it does.
is a much more complex structure. Human beings project these onto all sorts of other things around us. That doesn't mean that the thing we're projecting it on, it's applicable to really. A cat, I'm not going to say where it is on the line, but a cat left to its own devices in the natural world, you know, a lion or tiger or something in Africa, if something that they haven't made extinct, goes and gets food when it's hungry, and it can, and it probably has some vague feelings about it. I don't know that want is an appropriate term to use, though. I think it's very likely to be human projection.
So that's interesting, because to me it's obvious that the cat wants food. So I don't understand the difference between me and the cat when we both want food. I wouldn't know how to, I mean, to me it seems to be the same thing. So it's a new idea to me that maybe the cat doesn't want food, something else is going on.
The idea is it can go get it without wanting it, you mean? You're linking two concepts together.
Even fish feel desire.
Your cat can't retrieve food, you can, and so can the lion in the jungle.
The cat can chew through a bag of bread to get food if its bowl is empty.
It knows how to find food to some reasonable extent. That doesn't mean it wants food. I don't know that the term want applies to a cat. I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm saying it's very likely it's a human projection onto the cat.
We put our cats on a diet and they dig in our garbage and we had to buy garbage so it stops.
They get hungry, they go after food. That isn't.
We don't actually know what's going on in their head between.
We don't know what's going on in their head to know that the term want applies.
I don't know what's going on in your head.
Exactly. We're doing our best here and struggling. We're not getting answers, we're asking good questions to get ourselves.
They might have their own particular cat emotions that are distinct from human emotions.
Exactly. We don't know what they are. They might friend food, whatever that means. You know, and the best if there was a cat English dictionary, Fred might correlate to want, because that's the best we came up with. That doesn't mean this means the same thing and has all the same connotations. I mean, trying to open up minds and think and say, well, yeah, we're good at projecting. We're really, really good at projecting. As this, we see a face in the moon. That doesn't mean the moon is a entity that has a face.
We see ourselves in other things.
We will look at things and see faces, because our eyes are good at that and our visual processing. We look at entities that we interact with a lot and project emotions onto them. It's useful. It's convenient. It helps us correlate things. If we think that the cat wants food, we're more inclined to get food for the cat and be nice to the cat. This is productive for both us and the cat, because the cat is nice to us too.
The cats have learned, the most successful house cats are the ones who've learned to cause us to think they want food and to be pathetic and cute, but that doesn't mean
that's how they think internally.
Yeah, that doesn't mean that they're thinking about
and
wanting food or making us have a reaction.
Imagination.
Cat hater.
I am not.
It's like they're successful at getting certain reactions from us, and those reactions include a projection, but we don't really know
what's going on.
We don't really know what's going on their end. We only know that we've selected them for this behavior, essentially.
And that they've selected us for this behavior.
Yeah, that too.
This is a two-way street, people. Cats and dogs and probably parakeets.
I got here a little late. Did you guys talk about qualia / the Chinese room arguments against computers becoming conscious at all?
Actually, no.
The Chinese room. I don't know how many of you know the Chinese room argument. It's basically the most famous thought experiment against the idea of machines becoming conscious. The idea is there's a guy locked in a room. He doesn't understand Chinese at all. However, there are people outside the room that believe the room understands Chinese. So they slide things under the door. He looks up the symbols in a very complex book, which tells him exactly how to respond to every symbol, basically. And then and what to respond with. And then he writes the symbols that it tells him to and slides it back under the door. Now, the idea is the guy in the room doesn't understand Chinese, but it appears exactly as though he does. So that's actually an argument which has been used to...
Which is a way of describing the Turing test implementation.
Exactly. It's supposed to be an argument against... Personally, I think that's a terrible argument, because I would argue the entire room sort of understands. But I was just wondering if you guys had talked about that.
So we haven't talked about that, but it does illustrate the point. You can get the response without having the understanding.
Exactly.
And
You don't know what's in the cat's
well,
head or the
that's what
Chinese
they
room.
say. I say if the behavior is accurate enough, then that does show understanding. I think
well,
if
that's
the
actually
behavior-
depends on what you consider. The man may not, but as you said, the room and all things contained within it do.
Exactly. That would be like saying, well, this one stick of RAM doesn't understand all the calculations that are coming through, so therefore the entire computer is not good.
But that's also a different example of an emergent phenomenon, where if you look at any one of the pieces, there's no Chinese understanding going on. But the system as a whole gives every appearance of understanding Chinese. So again, I don't know whether you understand what I'm saying, but our interactions indicate the appearance that you do, so I'm going to act as if you do, because anything else lies madness.
But really, like, what is understanding anyway? Like, I don't know how I know what you... I don't know how I understand or respond to what you're saying, too.
It's really...
Yeah, this being a science fiction convention, I was wondering if people have had experience with Lyda Morehouse's book, Archangel Protocol, Fallen Host, Messiah Code, where she posits AIs, and two of them escape into the internet, and then the Japanese mob decides to kill one of them. And it's the description of what happens as you're trying to kill an AI.
Another book called Multiple Entity that was really good.
But anyway, I would highly recommend it. It's in this cyberpunk kind of, where people are positing one way or the other, and what is it like when an AI dies? How do they die?
One thing, rather than hardware coming to life, what about digital code coming to life, like viruses and things like that evolving on themselves or programming?
Reproducing themselves.
Continuously evolving, getting around, threats or blockages or things like that. So could digital life already be alive?
This is ancient history. This is like from the 90s, so you realize. This is not, could it happen? This is security people are dealing with this all the time now.
But it's humans reprogramming viruses. No?
No, they.
They've already passed that.
They
The
self-evolve.
better ones
Do
passed
robots.
that years and years and years ago.
Wow.
So could that be considered digital life though, since it does react and interact?
You could certainly argue it whether it's digital life. I don't feel any moral qualms about deleting one and getting rid of one. So I don't consider it to be murder. What's digital life is a whole different question. But anything that is as complex as a computer, and there's actually a specific Turing test different from what you're talking about whether something's Turing complete. Basically, is it sufficiently complex to be a general purpose computer? And the simplest possible one is incredibly simple. Okay, just bear that in mind. If you have a general purpose computer, you will also have viruses. You cannot have anything that is a general purpose computer that does not also have at least the possibility of creating viruses. And for any given virus, there's always a way to stop it, but there is no way to stop all possible viruses. So it goes back to any given attack, there's always a defense that can stop it, but there's no defense that will work against all attacks. It is not only the same concept, it is the same proof. It is exactly the same concept and the same proof. The universe is built into this way. So yeah, it's been around for a long time, and if you're one of the, McCaffrey and, the 80 people, you've been worrying about this for 10, 15 years. So.
An interesting question. Going back to what you said about if I had the only living computer or like conscious computer, I'm interested why you believe that you would kill it versus keeping it alive. I guess your own personal view of life, I think that is a good thing to do for humanity.
I'm not going to give it a chance. It could be good or bad. If it's good, that's one good person out of 8 billion that's gone. If it's bad, I've just saved all of humanity.
Don't plug it into nuclear weapons.
Could you, if it doesn't appear to be an overt threat, couldn't you keep it alive but isolated?
Yeah.
Unless it tries to get out.
So actually, that's a good question that you brought up. Doesn't the same logic apply to a baby? Even if it's the same race, it could potentially be
I'm
the
not
next.
afraid of a baby.
But you're afraid of what the baby might turn into.
But we have control over what the baby will turn into. We have control over what the baby will turn into because society raises a baby. If the computer is already a threat, if the computer is intelligent but sociopathic and more powerful and intelligent than a human being, and has access to all of the information that Google and Yahoo and the NSA and every other...
That's a bunch of ifs, but yes.
Yeah, I mean, that would be kind of scary.
Isn't that Lex Luthor?
Yeah, so why... And even Superman can't kill Lex Luthor and make him stay away, so...
Well, but that's comic books. No one really dies in comics.
There's something back there, sir. You got a question back there, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, I think we could probably agree that you shouldn't view consciousness as something that you either have or you don't. It's just kind of our consciousness and sentience as this kind of binary thing. But even with the most common way I think of trying to avoid that binary thinking, I think runs into problems where you try to view it as a spectrum where you've got bacteria on this end, and then fish, and then monkeys, and then humans, and maybe super smart computers beyond us. I think even there's a problem because you're assuming that, number one, there's only one dimension of measurement, and number two, that it's continuous. And I don't think either of those two assumptions are correct. I think it's much better to view consciousness as just a collection of elements of mental life. That, well, you might have this element of mental life, or you might have this other element of mental life, and maybe you add up enough of those together, and maybe some person somewhere might call that consciousness, but there's really no hard line of how many elements you need or what elements you need, but it's just different.
An n-dimensional array.
Yeah.
Where n is large, but we don't know exactly how many are. So there's a bunch of different ways, things you can measure.
And what if the interaction between those elements is actually where the emergent phenomenon comes in?
Yeah, I mean, but also...
Which elements do you need now?
And it's actually probably likely that it's the interaction. And not all, I mean, there's holes and gaps where it will work or not work. Just like chaotic phenomena where there are all these bands, you know, if you go here, you go this way, if you go there, you'll go to the other thing, you know, same thing. There might be, you know. If this value is 4, then this value has to be either 3 or 5, but if this value is 7, then this value must be 4 or 8, you know, type of things in order for conscious to happen. That's very possible. And your idea of many dimensions and not necessarily continuous things, I would be even willing to bet was likely.
Yeah.
Not just possible, but likely.
Last question.
Yes, going back on the other end, because I was talking about far future in my last question. What occurs to me is Teilhard de Chardin's The Phenomenon of Man, where this is definitely about emergent phenomena. And it's very useful to go back and look at that when he talks about emergent life, emergent consciousness, and then he uses a term that we've kind of forgotten called noosphere, the thinking sphere that happens as human beings become interconnected. But just from the point of view of emergent things, the book is called The Phenomenon of Man by Teilhard de Chardin. It was written, I believe, in the late 30s. The guy was a Jesuit archaeologist in China. There's some contradictions.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Great representation.